Geronimo and the Apache Wars, the final resistance. In this episode, we travel into the deserts, mountains, and canyons of the American Southwest to tell the story of Geronimo and the final Apache resistance. This is a story about war, survival, broken agreements, changing borders, and a people who fought desperately to protect their homeland and way of life. Geronimo was an Apache leader who became one of the most famous resistance fighters in American history. But to understand him, we must first understand the world he came from. For generations, Apache people lived across large portions of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, northern Mexico, and surrounding regions. They knew the mountains, deserts, rivers, and trails better than almost anyone who entered their homeland. Then the world around them began to change. Mexico expanded its power into the southwest. Later, the United States took control of much of that region. Soldiers, settlers, miners, ranchers, and railroads moved further into lands where Apache communities had lived for generations. Conflict followed. The Apache did not simply disappear, they resisted. And among the leaders who became famous during those years was Geronimo. Geronimo was born around 1829. His Apache name was Goye, often translated as the one who yawns. His life was deeply shaped by violence. As a young man, Geronimo lost members of his family during a conflict with Mexican forces. That experience helped shape the man he would become. From that point forward, Geronimo became a determined fighter. But we should be careful about turning him into either a hero without faults or a villain without understanding. Geronimo lived in an extremely violent time. Apache warriors attacked settlements and fought soldiers. Mexican and American forces pursued Apache communities. Families were killed, villages were destroyed, and people were captured and forced from their homelands. This was not a simple story of good people against bad people. It was a long and painful struggle between peoples fighting for survival, land, security, and control. During the 19th century, the United States attempted to place Apache groups onto reservations. Some Apache leaders accepted agreements, others resisted. Geronimo repeatedly surrendered and then escaped. He knew the mountains, he knew how to move quickly, and he understood the desert. Small groups of Apache fighters could travel through difficult country where large armies struggled to follow. By the 1870s and 1880s, the United States government was determined to end Apache resistance in the Southwest. Soldiers pursued Geronimo and other Apache leaders across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The campaign became exhausting for everyone involved. Imagine trying to chase a small group of people through hundreds of miles of mountains and desert. The Apache could disappear into the landscape. The army had horses, weapons, scouts, supply wagons, and eventually thousands of men involved in the larger campaign. Among these soldiers was General George Crook, an experienced commander who understood that simply chasing Apache fighters was not enough. Apache scouts became extremely important. Some Apache people served alongside the United States Army and helped track Geronimo because they knew the country and understood Apache methods of movement. This created a tragic reality. Native people were sometimes placed against other Native people. The Apache Wars were not simply Americans versus Indians. There were many different Native nations, communities, leaders, and interests involved. By the 1880s, Geronimo's band had become one of the last major groups, still resisting American authority in the Southwest. And then came the final campaigns. Geronimo surrendered in 1886, escaped, and surrendered again. The army kept pursuing him. Eventually, Geronimo and his followers surrendered for the final time in September 1886. The Apache resistance in the Southwest had reached its end. Geronimo was taken into military custody, but surrender did not mean returning home. That is one of the most important parts of the story. Geronimo and many Apache were removed from the Southwest. They were sent away from their traditional homelands. Families were separated. People lived far from the mountains and deserts they knew. For Geronimo, the war was over, but his captivity continued. He eventually became a well-known figure in American popular culture. He appeared at public events and he was photographed. He even participated in the 1905 inaugural parade for President Theodore Roosevelt. But behind the famous photographs was an older man who had spent much of his life fighting for the survival of his people, who had never returned to live freely in his original homeland. Geronimo died in 1909 at Fort Steele, Oklahoma. His story became larger than the man himself. Some Americans remembered him as a dangerous warrior. Others remembered him as a symbol of courage and resistance. But perhaps the most important thing is to remember that Geronimo was a human being, living through a tremendous period of change. The Apache Wars were not simply about battles. They were about land. They were about freedom, and they were about survival. Geronimo's story is therefore not simply the story of the last Apache warrior. It is the story of the end of an era. The final resistance of the Apache marked one of the last major chapters in the long conflict between the United States and Native peoples of the American West. And when Geronimo finally surrendered, the guns did not tell the whole story. The deeper story was about a homeland that had been transformed and people determined not to forget who they were. That is why Geronimo's name still echoes through American history. Not because the fighting lasted forever, but because his story reminds us that the end of a war does not always mean the end of its consequences. The Apache Wars ended, but the story of the Apache people did not. And that is where we leave episode 19. The guns fell silent, but the memory survived. Join us again for episode 20, Wounded Knee. God bless you guys.